one thing that's worth commenting on, and I don't think anyone does comment on it, or very few people have commented on it, is that we've actually become totally obsessive about research. Obsessive to the point where it's actually unhealthy and not helpful and kind of weird, if only we could see it. The reason we can't see it is because the word itself is used to bludgeon us, to cow us into submission, because it sounds so irreproachable. Just to mention research. And we can't say anything against it because it's research. Research has proven. Research has shown. How can anyone argue against research? So what we have here is the cult of research. We've made a fetish of research for undisclosed psychological reasons. Of course, everything happens for undisclosed psychological reasons. And if we were to disclose them, our reasons would have something to do with neophobia, the fear of newness. Because really what we're trying to do with research is create a world in which there is nothing that can take us by surprise. No jack-in-the-box that can pop out where we least expect it and scare the bejesus out of us. So we want a safe and tame world. We always want a safe and tame world. We've gone to extraordinary lengths to produce such a world. And science has been mistreated and abused to aid and abet us in this most unwholesome endeavour. And the reason I say it's most unwholesome, I hardly need to say why it's unwholesome, but the reason I say it's unwholesome is because it's profoundly mentally unhealthy. In the psychological sphere of things, the more risk we take, the healthier that is. The more I risk, the more I am, is a little slogan. I haven't a clue where it comes from. Now, normally we see risk-taking as a kind of thing that young males do, or adolescents, as part of their, no doubt, hormone-driven need to prove themselves, driving too fast, engaging in dangerous things. And then we settle down and we stop being so stupid. So we usually see risk in that negative way. But when we're talking psychologically, we don't mean risk in the sense of playing Russian roulette. Because if we did, then we could all become mentally healthy by playing Russian roulette, either literally with a gun or in some other way. And obviously that's not a formula for mental health, not that type of risk. But the type of risk we're talking about is the risk of being ourselves in such a way that we don't know if we're going to meet with approval or disapproval because we're not fitting in with the rule book or we're not fitting in with the social game. So that's one way of looking at it. And another way is to talk about existential risk. The existential philosophers make a point of saying that existence itself is a terrible risk. Which sounds kind of odd in one way, because we could say, well, yeah, it could be a risk if you're walking through a minefield or you're surrounded by animals that are about to eat you, or if you're in the middle of the M60 and there's cars going past at high speed all around you. But it could be such a thing as a safe existence as well. You could stay in your bedroom and take lots of vitamins and concentrate on staying safe. But this isn't quite what's meant. It's not that type of risk. Really, what we're talking about is the risk of what it means to exist truly, or exist authentically, whatever you might say. To be who you are, not particularly in terms of fitting into society, but just in general terms. It's such an audacious thing, because how do we know what existing is? How do we know how to go about it? Could I possibly watch a YouTube tutorial on how to exist? Because that's got to be tricky, because everything else comes from that. All the tricky things come from existing. So existing itself must be super tricky. So how do I do it? What errors must I avoid? What steps can I take to ensure that I exist and that something bad doesn't happen, or that I fail to exist? So all this type of thinking, I'm looking for support, I'm looking for scaffolding, I'm looking for some external authority, some guidelines, but there isn't any. There's no way anyone can tell us how to exist, and there's no one can tell us what it means, and I can't tell myself what it means. I can't work out what it means. I can't work out how it is done. So there's no framework of thought, and so there's this event that happens without a framework, an absolutely unprecedented event. And so that's the type of risk we're talking about. There's no precedence for it. There's no way to know how it's going to go, and there's no way even to know what it is. So from that point of view, that can evoke, is very likely to evoke fear, has a potential of evoking huge fear, the type of fear known as ontological terror, because we really would like to know a bit more about it before we do it. We'd like to read the guidebook. We'd like to get a bit more acclimatized, so we feel a bit more confident about it. We don't want to be thrown in on the deep end, basically, because that's the risk. Thrown in on the ontological deep end. In actual fact, we don't take that risk. In actual fact, we avoid the risk. We avoid ontological risk. And that might seem like a stupid thing to say, because here I am, I'm obviously existing. Well, obviously I'm existing as much as in the way that we generally understand existing, and so is everyone I see walking down the road here. So they're all doing it, so how hard can it be? And definitely, when we think about it, and when we think about the daily grind, the humdrum type of existence we have, whatever difficulties might be inherent in it, we don't spend a lot of time tuning into the sheer audacity of it. We don't really experience ourselves taking the plunge. Of course we don't. It's all just more of the same. It's all just carrying on. So what we do is we find a routine, or find a game, and then stick with it. And then we tell ourselves that this routine or this game is it. So then it's as if we have accepted the challenge of existence, and we're out there and we're doing it in a non-fearful way. But all we're doing is playing our game, or playing society's game, or playing the mind's game. And the mind's game is where we figure we know what life is, what existence is, and then we carry on doing what the mind tells us is existence or is life. under the impression that this really is what life is or what existence is. So these are all avoidances. So coming back to research, what I started off by saying is that research is part of this whole insidious process to eradicate genuine newness and to eradicate ontological risk. And this isn't too hard to see, because research is all about validating stuff and proving stuff so that we can say it's proved, it's been proved, it is officially validated, which means that it's not an ontological risk. It means it's not something we know nothing about or can know nothing about. It isn't the deep end anymore. It's mapped out territory. And the peculiar thing about that, there is a smell, there is a smell of rodent about this. And that is because the universe itself is sublimely and supremely unknowable and unmappable. Reality, as we could also say, equivalently say, is pure mystery. There's nothing we can say about it. The whole thing is completely unprecedented. If we can just snap out of the little view, the microscopic view, the kind of view of our daily lives and all the things in it, and just look at everything. The fact that we're here, the fact that anything is here, the fact that the universe is here, is that precedented? And we can see that it isn't as soon as we do take this step out of the small and the mundane, the little categories of the thinking mind, and we look at the whole thing in one go. We realize that it is unprecedented. We realize that there's no way we can rationalize it to ourselves or make it seem as if, oh yes, of course, reality, of course, life, yeah, of course, existence, of course. We can't do that at all. And instead, we're totally gobsmacked. And that is the only authentic response, because there is no way of doing research on the whole of everything. You can't do research on the whole of the universe. You can do research on tiny little bits of it, but you can't do research on the whole of it, because it reaches a point where there is no ability to say things about it that really tell us anything about it. All of our little ways of talking about reality are exposed as being little loops that feed on themselves, which we use to generate a sense of familiarity. And that familiarity is a function of our looking at things on a very, very small scale, which is a form of hiding, really. So we're hiding from the bigger picture, because the bigger picture is the ontological risk. Now, I'm not trying to say that research is the invention of the devil or anything like that. I'm just saying that it's become an obsession and we're using it for the wrong reason. And there's certain areas which we can't or shouldn't, or we can't legitimately use research. One would be in the furthest reaches of physics, because in the furthest reaches of physics, what we come up against is an unknown. And even in the, maybe not the furthest reaches of physics, but in everyday consideration of matter, when we look at the electron, we might think that an electron's a kind of pretty bland unit and we know all about it. Sure, it's only an electron. You've seen one, you've seen them all. So is an electron a known thing that we can just say, yep, It's a known thing, and it's not interesting because it has no, electrons don't have personalities, they don't have quirks, they don't have any nuanced existence. They're just bloody electrons, and that's it. That's what we might think, but then an electron really is, in a way, it's defined by everything around it and defined by us, our way of looking at it. And even then it isn't defined, because there's part of it that isn't defined, but the small bit of it which we can say something about, that little bit of its manifestation that we can say something about, is entirely contextual, based on the particles around it and based upon us looking at it. So that's just saying it's a mystery. We'd like to see what an electron on its own, outside of all contextual considerations, looks like, but we can't. That's an absolute impossibility, because there is no such thing as an electron as a thing. That's just a function of our matter-of-fact categorical thinking. It's not a function of what the world is actually like in its essence. The world in its essence does not contain things. As Bodhidharma said, from the very beginning, not a thing was. So Bodhidharma wasn't a quantum physicist or anything like that, but he's saying the same thing that modern physicists would say. So the idea of doing research so as to prove what the essential nature of things are or is clearly ridiculous. And then another area in which research is clearly ridiculous is when it comes to psychology. It's fair enough to say psychology was never really meant to be an experimental discipline, even though we've tried very hard to make it into one, and has been noted. Our motivation for trying to be so rigorously experimental in psychology is because we want to be like the big sciences, the proper sciences, the hard sciences, the sciences that really are sciences, in other words. So some wit made the comment that psychology suffers from physics envy, because boy do we wish we could be like physics. But in the 100 years or so, 150 years of the existence of psychology as a discipline, we've produced nothing at all to compare in any way with all of the things that have come out of physics. So well might we suffer from physics envy, because physics has got something we will never have. So we just have to carry on being terribly envious. But why have we made things so hard for ourselves? Why try to be like an experimental science when that doesn't really work for psychology? As Jung said, the further we go in the direction of trying to be purely experimental psychologists, the more dry and pointless will that discipline become, because it's missing the really interesting stuff in favor of the boring, trivial stuff that we can at least turn into metrics. The really interesting stuff we can't turn into metrics. Of course we can't. So that was something Jung said a long time ago. And I think it's fair enough to say back in those days, psychologists were thinking in all sorts of directions. And they hadn't narrowed down into this extremely defensive posture of trying to prove absolutely everything and do everything in an absolutely rigorous way. Basically, kill themselves doing that, but produce nothing at the end of it, because nothing has been produced at the end of it. So we're playing safe. It's a kind of a fearfulness about taking risks and just coming out with stuff, or just plunging into new ways of expressing what it is we want to talk about, and taking the risk of doing it in a non-apparently scientific way or a non-technical way. Which actually brings us, if we could do that, that would bring us more into the territory of art, because that's what art does. Art is fearless in that way. It'll try any metaphor, any expression at all. And even though in art, as in everywhere else, there's a deadening conservative tendency to say what art is and make this into some kind of gold standard. And that happens a lot, of course. But then when it does happen, we're actually destroying what art is, just as if we were doing the same to poetry, and we were being very strict about what poetry ought to be or how it should be. Then that isn't poetry anymore. It's just an act of conformity. It's an act of social conformity for the sake of getting validation. But art and poetry doesn't need validation, because there is an authenticity in its expression which we know and which we can feel. And when we feel it, that's what we know, that's what it's all about. Not having some panel of experts or some professional body rubber stamping what we've done or what we've said. And of course it can be seen in our university system, in our third level education system. Everything has come about proving what we say in terms of what other authenticated people have said or are saying, or thereby rubber stamping what we're saying. So in the end we say nothing at all because we're afraid to say anything. Quite legitimately, because if we do say anything new, you won't be granted any qualifications for that. We won't get anywhere for it at all. So in one way, we're right to be afraid of being original, because being original in terms of the social system, obviously, it's not going to get us anywhere. But in terms of personal growth, it will, of course, get us everywhere. Thanks for watching.